My silence turned into a whisper, and I wrote it in the Jesus diary, my diary. Today, I stood before them, not as a healer, not as a teacher, not even as a man, but as a choice. Barabbas or me, life or me. And in that moment, before the shouting, before the crowd gave its answer, there was silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any cry. The kind that holds the weight of every decision that has ever mattered. And in that stillness, I saw it. A face. One face. In a sea of hundreds, filled with rage, confusion, noise, there was one that didn't agree. One that wasn't yelling. One that wasn't looking away. He wasn't trying to save me, but he wasn't condemning me either. His eyes held sorrow, recognition, regret, and that shook me to my core. Because for a moment, I wasn't staring at the crowd. I was staring into humanity, into what could have been, into what still might be. A soul caught between truth and silence. A witness who couldn't speak. But I heard him. I saw him. And before they chose Barabbas, I remembered something eternal. It only takes one heart to break heaven open. If you've ever felt like your voice was too small, like you saw what was right, but couldn't change what was happening, touch this message with a like. Not for me, but for that one face that still lives inside you. The air was thick with dust and judgment. Heat rose from the stones beneath my feet, but the chill came from their eyes. The sun stood high above us, blazing in the sky, but inside me, it felt like twilight. The kind of twilight that doesn't come from the sun setting, but from something much deeper, the dimming of trust, the fading of memory. It was a darkness that begins not in the sky, but in the heart of a crowd. They pressed forward, men, women, children, drawn not by hope, but by hunger. Some still wiped crumbs from their lips. Others clenched stones and fingers once opened for healing. These hands had once reached for me. Now they closed. And yet, the atmosphere was not loud. Not at first. It pulsed. It waited. There was tension in the dust, anticipation in the silence. A thirst, not for truth, but for a spectacle. Not for justice, but for blood. The Roman guards stood in control, keeping bodies in line, but they did not hold the silence. That silence belonged to me. Inside, I did not shout. I did not struggle. I did not defend. I listened. I listened to the breath of a crowd, trying to decide if I was still worth saving. If the healer who once fed them now deserved a cross. If the man who wept with them now deserved to be erased. Then Pilate's voice cut through the thickness of it all, sharp and strange. Barabbas. A name they hadn't expected. A name they hadn't heard in so long. A name they never thought would be their alternative to me. And in that moment, something shifted, not just around me, but within them. Eyes flickered, hearts shrank. Some flinched, some smiled, as if the chaos gave them purpose. And others, too many, opened their mouths and shouted without knowing why. But before they could choose, before the sound of my name was drowned by the call for another, I saw him. One man, one face. He didn't yell. He didn't cheer. He didn't hide. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. Not with hate, not with devotion. Just torn between what he felt and what he feared. And I felt it, not as a king above the crowd, but as a man among them. Because the weight of this moment wasn't in what they would decide. It was in the hesitation of one heart that still hadn't, and in the swirl of dust beneath my feet, before history took its next breath. I locked eyes with the one soul who wasn't shouting, but wasn't gone either. He wasn't at the front. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply stood there, just behind the first row of voices, as if he didn't belong to either side. Not Roman, not disciple, not accuser, just human. His robe was simple, his eyes restless. He didn't wear hatred on his face, but he didn't wear courage either. He looked like someone caught in a place he didn't ask to be, like someone who knew what was right and knew it was already too late to say it. No one else noticed him, but I did, because while others looked at me, he looked into me. And for a moment, I didn't feel like the accused. I felt like the remembered. He didn't try to stop the crowd. He didn't cry out for me. But his silence was not empty. It was full of grief, full of a cry buried so deep, only I could hear it. That was the pain, to stand before hundreds of voices and feel the one that isn't speaking. To feel his conflict more than their certainty. To see the one who didn't agree, but didn't know how to stand alone. And in that face, I saw every heart that ever wanted to do right, but froze in fear. I saw every soul that watches injustice and wishes it could undo it. I saw the tension of truth meeting silence. And I felt it, not as a savior above him, but as a brother beside him. Because the greatest ache is not being hated. It's being known and still not saved. I stood in silence. The crowd roared around me, but I wasn't listening to their words. I was watching their faces. Rage twisted some. Curiosity marked others. Most of them didn't even look at me. They looked past me, as if I were already gone. As if I were no longer a man, only a decision. A name to shout, a problem to remove. And then I saw him. One face. Still, quiet, not angry, not cruel, just broken. He didn't scream Barabbas. He didn't scream Jesus either. But his eyes screamed something no voice ever could. I saw fear there, but also recognition. And that's what shook me. Because in those few seconds before Pilate raised his hand, I saw someone who knew. He knew I was innocent. He knew what the crowd was doing was wrong. He knew this moment would mark him forever. But he didn't speak. Not because he didn't care, but because his fear was louder than his faith. And I understood that. I didn't resent it. I felt it, because that's what I came for. Not just to face the crowd, but to meet the one who couldn't speak. To meet the soul trapped between love and survival. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a disciple. Just a man. A man who knew the truth and couldn't carry it out loud. And that became my greatest grief that day. Not the verdict, not the injustice, but that face, that ache, that silence that spoke of every human heart caught in the war between knowing and doing nothing. And as Pilate's voice rang out, as the crowd shouted Barabbas with fury, I didn't hear them. I heard him, his silence, his sorrow, his soul, and I whispered inside myself, I'm doing this for you, because I knew that later, after the stones had cooled and the blood had dried, he would remember that moment. He would remember that his eyes met mine, that I saw him, that I knew him, and maybe he would weep, and maybe he would wish he had shouted, but he didn't need to, because even without words, I had already forgiven him. That is what love does. Love doesn't wait for strength. It meets you in your weakness. Love doesn't need you to speak perfectly. It hears you even when you're silent. Love doesn't walk away when the crowd overwhelms. It stays with the one who couldn't push through it. And that day, before they chose Barabbas, I chose him. I chose to carry the weight of his silence, so he wouldn't have to carry the weight of shame. I chose to bleed so he could break and still come back. I chose to be shouted down, so he could one day lift his voice in grace, not guilt. That is who I am. That is what I came for. Not just for the innocent, not just for the faithful, but for the one who stands in the crowd, eyes full of truth, lips locked by fear, and still wants to be mine. If you've ever been that one face, if you've ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken, if you've ever watched injustice and felt too small to stop it, this page is for you. I saw you. I still see you. And I never looked away. Subscribe to this diary, not just with a click, but with your heart. Not because you've shouted loud, but because you've been seen in silence. Because even if you never said my name out loud, I've always known yours. And on this day, I learned something not written in the scrolls. I learned that love doesn't need a voice to be real. That sometimes the greatest cries come in the form of a gaze held too long and a silence too heavy to carry. I used to think the most painful part of rejection would be the anger, the hatred, the lies, the fists raised against the truth. But it wasn't. The deepest pain came from the eyes that agreed with me and said nothing. And yet, they loved me, not with strength, not with clarity, but with ache. And that ache taught me something holy, that compassion can live inside fear, that the seed of faith can tremble and still be planted. And I understood something my father had long carried. It's not the strength of a soul that makes it worthy of grace. It's the honesty of its longing. That man, that one face in the crowd, reminded me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it stares back, unable to move, but still full of truth. And I chose to embrace even that kind of love, because it is real, and real love, no matter how quiet, can still be redeemed. So I carried his silence with me, not as a wound, but as a whisper of why I was still going forward. Today, I wasn't chosen, but I wasn't alone. The crowd made their decision. The voices rose, fists clenched, hearts closed. And yet, one heart trembled. One face stayed with me long after the shouts faded. He didn't speak. He didn't stop it. But he didn't agree. And somehow that mattered. It mattered more than the verdict, more than the noise, because it reminded me that even in the middle of betrayal, there can still be belief. Quiet, hidden, but alive. Today, I didn't receive a defense. I received a look, a silent cry, a soul stuck between knowing and acting. And that face saved something inside me. It saved me from forgetting why I was doing this. Not for the crowds, but for the ones who broke in silence. For the ones whose hearts speak louder than their voices ever could. So I end this page not with triumph, but with tenderness. With a question, not for them, for you. When the world is choosing, what does your face say? Because I'm still watching, still listening, still loving. Even the ones who couldn't scream, but couldn't turn away either. Neo dis nada. Apenas dixi que aquel momento verás palavra, no meu Jesus diary. If this page in my diary found your heart, don't keep it silent. There is someone in your life who feels like that one face. Someone who knows the truth, but doesn't feel strong enough to speak it. Someone whose silence is filled with longing. Share this. Let this be the voice they couldn't find on their own. And if you still feel the weight of things you didn't say, know this. You're still seen. You're still loved. And grace is still reaching. Watch the video appearing on your screen now. Let the next page speak where words still fail. Let it remind you, I never looked away, and I still see you.